We bring in Fox News chief political anchor of Special Report, Bret Baier, on the phone. Bret, what do you make of the president saying Kelly's out without naming a replacement and then saying we're going to name somebody, but maybe interim basis?
Well, good afternoon. I think that that is how this president operates. It's kind of like a tease to something to come, and he's going to make an announcement. It's likely going to be Nick Ayers, the vice president's chief of staff, who we've seen travel with President Trump on Air Force One without Vice President Pence. So he's established this close relationship and respect with Nick Ayers outside of the vice president being present there. So it's the going bet is that he will be the choice because he's a political operative and heading into a new dynamic with House Democrats taking control in January and obviously setting up for eventually another run in 2020. One believes that that will be something to tap into. I think the big moment here is not that this happened. It's more a look at John Kelly's stint. You know, when he came in, he was a very controlling force that calmed down a undisciplined, frankly, White House. So he made the trains run on time and controlled access to the Oval Office. It was seen to really get the White House more in a operational sense, better organized. But that then, made some people mad, including the president at times, and has been widely reported about, dust-ups that they had over recent months.
You talked about Nick Ayers and the relationship the president had with him. Going back to some reporting from October of 2017, a little more than a year ago, when then Nick Ayers, chief of staff to Vice President Pence, was meeting with some wealthy GOP donors, and he reportedly said that he wanted to purge GOP lawmakers that didn't quickly enough rally around the president's agenda. Is this now bringing in a much harder line, more savvy, tougher political operator to try and whip Capitol Hill as the Republicans go into the minority in the House?
Definitely. I mean, his whole being before this current job was political operative, knowing where the skeletons are buried in Washington, an operator in Republican circles, and somebody who knows Capitol Hill very well. So obviously, in that instance where you're talking about that reporting, that's something that President Trump echoed from a news conference right after the midterm election, talking about Republicans who lost, saying they should have rallied around the Trump administration and the president himself.
So, Bret, if John Kelly was able to bring in the order and the discipline that the Trump White House at that point in time so desperately needed, what would somebody like Nick Ayers be able to bring in with his background heading into 2020 and heading into this moment where Democrats are about to take control of the House and you've got the Mueller investigation really seeming to hit a fever pitch?
Yeah, I think it's maneuvering, finding the cracks to where there could be negotiation. Remember, there's probably going to be a lot of subpoenas that are issued for administration officials. There will be investigations that are going forward. And in that, there will still be legislation that House Democrats will want to get through. All of that requires a deft political touch, and perhaps the president is going to choose Nick Ayers to do that. Again, we're speculating now, and he is the leading front runner because the president has teased that he's going to make this announcement over the next couple of days. If you look at this exit of Kelly means that in the White House itself, since his election, there have been 3 communications directors, a national security advisor switch, and a press secretary, let alone outside of the White House proper, and all of the shifts that have happened in this administration. There's been a lot of turnover. After a midterm election, often there are jobs that shift. This administration has seen more than most.
You said an interesting word, and you're right that we are speculating on Nick Ayers, but you said a deft political hand. Is Nick Ayers a deft political hand, or is he a political hammer?
I think he can be both. It's cracking the whip and keeping people in line is one thing, but also knowing how some congressman or some chairman of a committee, what issues he or she is interested in and can be negotiated with, dealing with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, specifically Pelosi now, who will likely take the speakership and deal with the gavel there on the House side. It's much more a political-looking job as you have another party taking over one chamber of Congress and you get ready for a re-election. John Kelly was well-positioned to structure access to try to get things, pieces of the puzzle put on the table for the president, was not as accomplished when it came to, the political ins and outs of Washington, D.C. Had a very successful stint, Kelly did, at Homeland Security, and was largely seen as getting a White House, and when I say organized and on track, from where it was. Obviously, there are a lot of stories about different elements of the White House not working effectively, but Kelly tried to get everything on the train track.
We've been focusing so much on Nick Ayers, and of course, there's a very good probability that he will be the next chief of staff. But you know better than anyone else, Bret, that nothing is final until President Trump says it's final. So I'm curious, are you hearing any other names other than Ayers as a possible replacement to John Kelly?
Well, for a long time, Mick Mulvaney was talked about as a possible chief of staff, and his name was still surfacing around. I think that has fallen off, but again, you don't know what you don't know with the Trump administration and the president's choices. I do think it's probably going to be Ayers. And I think that there's going to be a lot of different efforts. Remember the White House counsel also switched just recently, and the legal staff in the White House is going to be girding for a battle, not just with House Democrats, but obviously with the fallout from the Mueller investigation and whatever comes out of the Southern District of New York.
Hey, Bret, as the president was leaving the White House and announcing that John Kelly was leaving, he said he was a great guy and appreciated his service. You had one of the more telling and fascinating interviews with John Kelly that have been done, perhaps the one that made by far the most amount of news and reportedly really rankled the president in the way Kelly reacted. Any thoughts on where the relationship between president and chief of staff broke down, where you went from John Kelly will be here through 2020 to he's out after the midterms?
I think there's a lot of elements to it. I'm not sure that the family ever really enjoyed Kelly's style of controlling access to the president, and so that was a sling and arrow towards him. I think that the president got frustrated that somehow he was trying to be controlled in one way or another. But in that interview that I did with General Kelly, that as White House Chief of Staff, he was very honest, and I think that's often the issue in Washington. It gets you in trouble, and I think he may have gotten on the wrong side of the president on the way he described the wall, on the way he described being paid for by Mexico, a number of different elements of that interview that perhaps the president didn't like. But if you look back at John Kelly's service, first of all, to the country as a Marine general, and long service, and believed that as Homeland Security Secretary and as White House Chief of Staff, he was continuing to serve the country in a different way, but in the same kind of vein as he did as a military man in uniform. And obviously lost his son in the war in Afghanistan, has really served the country tremendously for a long, long time, and has said that job was the toughest he'd ever had. He used some different words in the Woodward book, which he later said that he didn't say. But I think that people will look back and say, this guy really put it out for the country.
It would be impossible to say anything else in terms of that. Bret Baier, anchor of Special Report, 6 p.m. Eastern, Monday. Bret, we can say it every weekend. You're going to have a lot to talk about.
All the time.
All the time. Thank you,
Thanks,
sir.
Bret.
Enjoy your Saturday. All right.